Well, thank you very much, David, and welcome to the release of our findings for the 2011 Press Freedom Index. As many of you may know, this covers the events that took place during 2010, calendar year 2010. First, I'd like to thank the rest of our research and publication staff in New York, as well as all our consultant analysts and advisors, without whom putting together this index every year would not be possible. And I'd also like to thank the Newseum for hosting the map and this World Press Freedom Gallery and bringing this topic to a much wider audience. I know this is a little bit difficult given the news last night. I'll try and make this press conference as interesting as Obama's was last night, but it's a tough act to follow. But thank you very much all for being here to cover our findings. Since we have limited time, I'll jump right in and talk about our main findings in terms of the global picture. In 2010, of the 196 countries and territories that we assessed, a total of 68, or 35%, were rated in the free category. 65, or 33%, were rated in our partly free category, and 63, or 32%, were rated not free. This balance of countries is almost exactly the same as the last year's index. However, in terms of population, we have a much bleaker picture. We found that only 15% of the world's inhabitants, only 1 in 6, live in countries that have a free press, while 42% have a partly free press, and 43% live in countries with not free media environments. The percentage of countries that have free media in 2010 declined by another point to the lowest level since 1996 when we began looking at population data. Meanwhile, the share living in not free countries jumped by 3 percentage points, largely because of the movement of 3 very populous countries into this category in 2010. Looking at the overall level of press freedom worldwide, as measured by our global average score, this actually leveled off in 2010, suggesting that an 8-year trend of declines that we've been seeing every year since 2002 may finally be coming to an end. In terms of regional trends, we saw that the most significant regional decline occurred in the Middle East and North Africa, while smaller negative trends were apparent in the Americas, the Asia-Pacific region, and Western Europe. Declines in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Baltic states were balanced by improvements in several countries in the former Soviet Union, leading to a sort of balanced picture in that region. And meanwhile, Sub-Saharan Africa registered significant gains in 2010 and was the only region this year to show improvement. I'll turn to 5 key trends that we noted, which can sort of give a little bit of background and explain some of the movements that we've been seeing. First, the misuse of licensing and regulatory frameworks has emerged as a key method of control. In a number of semi-democratic and authoritarian settings, governments are increasingly using bogus legalistic maneuvers to narrow the space for independent broadcasting, effectively countering an earlier trend of growth in the number of private radio and television outlets. In Russia, Venezuela, and a range of other countries, denial or suspension of broadcast licenses or closure of outlets on spurious grounds are preferred methods for suppressing unwelcome views. Second, control over the new means of news dissemination, particularly internet-based social media, has become a priority for authoritarian governments. As media delivery systems have expanded to include satellite television, the internet, and increasingly mobile telephones as well, governments have intensified efforts to exert control over the new means of communication, as well as the news outlets that employ them. In addition to the blocks imposed in repressive countries such as China, Iran, Syria, and Vietnam, some democratic and semi-democratic states have also moved to implement additional controls, including South Korea and Thailand, which we saw in 2010 increased censorship of online content. Third, the role of non-state forces in the suppression of press freedom is growing and is a concern in a number of countries. In 2010, the prime example of this phenomenon was Mexico, where violence associated with drug trafficking led to a dramatic increase in attacks on journalists, rising levels of self-censorship and impunity, as well as aggressive attempts by organized crime groups to control the news agenda. Fourth, worsening violence against the press and impunity for such crimes are forcing journalists into self-censorship or exile. The level of physical harassment directed at the press by both official and non-state actors is rising and remains a key concern in a number of countries. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, some of the deadliest countries for journalists in 2010 were Honduras, Indonesia, Iraq, Mexico, and Pakistan. These attacks have a chilling effect on the profession, encouraging self-censorship or exile, and the failure to punish or even seriously investigate crimes against journalists has reached scandalous proportions. And finally, threats to media freedom remain a concern not only in these very repressive environments, but also in established democracies. In recent years, we have seen declines in Italy and South Africa, and in 2010, the government of Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Hungary pushed restrictive legislation through the parliament and seized control over media regulators and public broadcasters. Turning now to the status changes that we've noted for 2010, which can be seen on the map behind me. And so we have nine movements this year, 5 in a negative direction and 4 in a positive direction, which is actually a little bit more even than recent years. First, moving from free to partly free, we have South Korea to reflect the increase in official censorship, particularly online, as well as the government's attempt to control and influence media outlets' news and information content through interfering in the management of major broadcast media. Next, moving from partly free to not free, we have Egypt as a result of a crackdown prior to and during the November 2010 parliamentary elections, which included legal harassment, spurious arrests, and violations of due process against journalists and bloggers. The pre-election period in Egypt last year also saw the banning of satellite television outlets and SMS news services, which were both key outlets for disseminating independent views. In the Americas, Honduras moved from partly free to not free as well because of a marked increase in harassment and attacks on journalists since the inauguration of President Lobo in January 2010 and an environment of impunity for murderers of media workers. Mexico moved from partly free to not free also due to the escalating drug wars which have taken their toll on journalists. As I mentioned before, violence and intimidation by cartels has led to a steadily increasing climate of impunity, heightened self-censorship, and the murders of more than 60 journalists over the past 10 years. During 2010, the nature of drug cartels' control over the news agenda expanded from censorship of media content to concerted attempts to place propaganda in certain media outlets. And finally, Thailand moved from partly free to not free due to the use of restrictive new legislation, such as the Computer Crimes Act, to punish online expression, a continued increase in investigation and prosecution of lèse-majesté cases, and periodic clashes between political factions that made reporting more difficult as journalists were caught in the crossfire and media outlets were censored. Now, some of the good news. Moving from not free to partly free, we had Moldova to reflect a range of policies enacted by the new ruling coalition, including laws providing increased protection for press freedom and journalist rights, as well as the reform of the regulatory framework. In addition, the management of the state broadcaster was professionalized and new private broadcast media outlets opened, leading to less political control over content and greater media diversity. In Africa, we had 3 positive movements, all in West Africa. Guinea was actually one of our biggest score changes of the year and also moved from not free to partly free due to policies enacted by a new transitional government, including a constitution providing protection for press freedom and 2 new media laws passed in June 2010. Additionally, there was a decrease in legal and physical harassment of journalists, as well as a decline in political censorship. Liberia moved from not free to partly free, mostly as a result of a passing of Freedom Information Act, and there was also a decrease in physical attacks against journalists in 2010. And finally, Niger moved also from not free to partly free after a transitional military government created a new, more independent media regulatory body and allowed a private radio station closed by the previous government to open. Legal and extrajudicial harassment of journalists, censorship, and official control over media content were all substantially reduced. I'll look now at our worst of the worst category, which is our 10 worst rated countries in the world. In 2010, these continued to be, as in previous years, Belarus, Burma, Cuba, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. In these states, which are scattered around the globe, independent media are either non-existent or barely able to operate, the press acts as a mouthpiece for the regime, citizens' access to unbiased information is severely limited, and dissent is crushed through imprisonment, torture, and other forms of severe repression. Finally, I'd like to place some of our findings in context and also look forward a little bit. As I mentioned above, the global media environment, which has experienced a pattern of deterioration for the past 8 years, did show some signs of stabilizing in 2010. Countries that had significant score movements actually were even, and as I said, the global average score remained largely the same. So, and then prospects for a reversal of this negative trend have been enhanced by the protest movements that emerged across the Middle East in the early months of 2011, which have led to some very positive developments for media freedom, particularly so far in Tunisia and Egypt. Denial of media freedom in the previous year and freedom of expression have played a key role in the demands for change that swept across the region. And we hope that these positive changes in early 2011 will lead to some more positive news next year in terms of our index. But it definitely right now is too soon to tell. As we saw in 2010, many of the dramatic openings required a change of government and a broad political commitment to reform. Smaller improvements in a number of other countries came as the result of legal and regulatory reform, and notably, many of these victories were achieved only after lengthy advocacy campaigns by journalists and civil society activists. The passing of the Freedom of Information Law in Liberia is one example of this. The explosive growth in internet and mobile phone usage, particularly in the developing world, has also created a variety of new channels for the flow of information, with the result that complete state control over the news is virtually impossible. Taken together, these trends suggest that future expansion of both media freedom and general political and broader freedoms will require sustained support for legal and regulatory reforms, for the freedom of the internet and other new media, and also support for those engaged in pushing back against official repression and threats from non-state actors, be they journalists, press freedom activists, or independent media companies. I think I'll stop here so we have a little time for Q&A. Thank you very much. There's much more information available online at www.freedomhouse.org. And now we'll open it up for a few questions. Thank you. Yes? Actually, the scores for both countries remained virtually unchanged. What we see in both countries, I believe, is a sort of cat and mouse game where there is obviously severe control over news media and the media content, but where people are trying to push back against these very repressive boundaries. So in China, there was a continued crackdown against both traditional journalists and bloggers. In Vietnam also, for example, they were banning Facebook, things like that. So there are definitely controls in place by both governments to hold on to the news agenda, but I would say activists in both countries are pushing back. But in general, both of the scores remain unchanged, and they remain in our not free category and, in the worst performers worldwide.
Cambodia have been declines in the press release, and why is decline?
Well, there are many reasons. I mean, several I did mention. But in general, I think there are, as there are positive movements, and journalists in many countries are trying to push back, and the new media is providing an avenue for this opportunity. Governments, especially authoritarian governments who would like to retain control of the news and content, are really pushing back. So in many countries, we see the use of lawsuits. We see increases in physical and harassment and murders. The numbers by CPJ show an increase since the mid-90s in murders. And we also see very novel methods of trying to control the press. The Press Freedom Index also looks at economic factors. So we might look at advertising boycotts, attempts to control content through bribery in certain countries. So governments are actually very, very, determined in many ways to push back. And so we see that although there are positive movements, so far there's been more negative. And we're hoping maybe this will change next year. Any other questions?
How would you describe the situation in former Soviet states? What are the trends more specifically?
Well, basically in the last few years, we've seen a huge decline in the former Soviet Union. And this year, there was actually mixed news, and it was a little bit positive. This was driven mostly by the big opening in Moldova, as I mentioned. But we also saw positive movement in Kyrgyzstan and in Georgia. Kyrgyzstan, although there was a lot of political ferment last year with a change of government and there was a serious outbreak of ethnic violence, there was positively a reform of public broadcasting law. There was a decrease in libel suits against journalists, and there were some other positive trends that we saw. So Kyrgyzstan actually improved, and we hope that under the new government things will continue to improve in Kyrgyzstan. It's actually a relatively bright spot in the region compared to its neighbors, which, as I said, rank among the worst performers worldwide. Georgia as well saw some regulatory reforms, and also a lack of sort of legal harassment and physical harassment. So those were some of the bright spots in the former Soviet Union this year. But in general, the situation remains very bleak. If you look at Russia and some of the neighbors, it's a very bad situation. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan are also very bad.
And Ukraine?
Ukraine actually showed backsliding this year. We saw that since the new government came in, there has been backsliding. There were attempts to withdraw licenses from several radio stations. There was a murder of journalists, and there was increasing physical attacks. So we see that the promise that we saw in Ukraine several years ago, there seems to be some backsliding. Freedom House actually just recently, last week, released a special report on Ukraine, which does touch on some of these issues. So I'd encourage you to look at that as well. But Ukraine is definitely, that's one of the best performers in the region, and we saw some negative backsliding this year in Ukraine.
Today you start to display the 100 newspaper here. So could you give me any comment on that?
Do you mean the Newseum's newspapers downstairs, or?
No, he's talking about this one.
Oh, this one here. I wasn't responsible for that, so I can't comment, actually. Maybe Susan could comment.
We were very fortunate. In the midst of the disaster, some of the Japanese newspapers obviously lost their power and their ability to print on printing presses, but because they were so concerned about the people of their cities, they hand-wrote newspapers, and we were able to get several of the copies actually, of the handwritten newspapers, and we're very proud to display them in the museum today.
It's out front.
Any final questions?
Can you comment the situation in Kosovo as far as the trend from 2006 to 2011 is concerned? We have seen declines for 7 points, Kosovo and Hungary. So I would just like to know more about this.
Yeah, well, Kosovo this year remained, I think, largely unchanged as well. It wasn't one of the countries that showed major movement. There are still issues with the legal environment, and there are some cases also of intimidation and attacks against journalists. And the economic environment also remains a little bit worrying. So in general, we did not see a major movement in Kosovo this year. It's been largely steady, so at least it's not bad news. Serbia actually showed a little bit more improvement. It's basically the same score, but it's actually inching up a little bit towards our free category. I think the score is about 33 points at this point. So it's largely steady as well in Serbia, and we did not see any major changes in the environment.
The Arab world is witnessing, awakening in the spring, and there is always a crackdown on Facebook. Can you please give me, and especially in Syria, they still manage to get the footage out. Just like, what do you think this is like from a Freedom House, point of view with all this crackdown? Just like one quote.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, it's what we've seen earlier this year and then now in Syria is very similar to what we saw in Egypt and Tunisia, where the governments are trying to really control all means of news dissemination, and yet citizens are managing to get out information by very inventive means. And I think that gives us cause for hope that the will of the people to have greater press freedom and freedom of expression will ultimately prevail over the will of very repressive governments in the region. So I hope that the trends we've seen already with Tunisia and Egypt will continue with Syria. Thank you.